My dear viewers, you are not just my viewers, you are my family. This channel belongs to all of us, and we can only grow it by supporting each other and moving forward together. Now, let's show our power. Our target is to reach 1,000 subscribers in just 5 days. I truly need your support. Please subscribe, share the videos, like, comment, and stay connected with us. Every single person matters and brings us one step closer to our goal. Let's prove what we can achieve together. Target: 1,000 subscribers in 5 days. Thank you so much for your love, support, and trust. Let's make it happen together. I need you to come to my next appointment alone, without anyone else knowing. That was the text I got from my ex-girlfriend Wren, 3 weeks after we'd broken up. For weeks after she'd first told me she was pregnant, and the specific request, alone without anyone else knowing, sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time, though I'd understand exactly why within the month. I'm Desmond, 30, work as a software developer, and Wren and I had been together just under 2 years before things ended. A breakup that came after months of growing distance rather than any single dramatic event, the kind of ending where both people can sense it coming long before either says it out loud. We'd split amicably enough, or as amicably as breakups ever really go, agreeing to give each other space, no dramatic blow-up, just a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that whatever we'd been building together had stopped working for both of us. Then, 3 weeks after that breakup conversation, Wren called me, her voice shaky, telling me she was pregnant, that she'd taken multiple tests, that she was scared and didn't know what to do, and that she needed to talk to me because obviously this changed everything between us regardless of the breakup. I sat with that news for days, cycling through every possible emotion: shock, fear, a complicated tangle of responsibility towards someone I genuinely loved even as our relationship had ended, and underneath all of it, a persistent, quiet unease I couldn't fully explain. Given that we'd broken up nearly a month before she told me, and given some details about the timeline that didn't quite add up the way I expected them to when I actually sat down and did the math. Wren told me she was about 6 weeks along when she first broke the news, which meant, counting backward, conception would have happened right around the time we broke up, possibly slightly before, in that final stretch of our relationship when things had already grown distant and strained enough that we'd barely been intimate in the weeks leading up to the actual breakup conversation. I didn't say anything about that discrepancy immediately, partly because bringing up something like that felt cruel and suspicious in the middle of what was supposed to be a serious, emotional conversation about an unplanned pregnancy, and partly because I told myself the timeline math might simply be imprecise. Early pregnancy dating isn't always exact, and I didn't want to seem like I was looking for reasons to doubt her during what should have been a moment of mutual support regardless of our romantic status. Over the following weeks, Wren and I talked regularly, working through what this actually meant for both of us, whether we might try reconciling given the circumstances, what co-parenting might look like if we didn't, the entire complicated logistics of an unplanned pregnancy layered on top of an already ended relationship. I found myself, despite everything, slowly settling into a kind of protective, responsible mindset, showing up for what felt like the right thing to do regardless of how confused and uncertain I still felt about the actual timeline. Then came that text, 3 weeks after she'd first told me, asking me to come to her upcoming doctor's appointment, but specifically, deliberately, alone, without anyone else knowing. I asked her what she meant by that, whether she meant without our families knowing yet, which would have made sense given how early we still were in processing everything ourselves. Her response, when it came, only deepened the unease I'd been quietly carrying since first hearing about the pregnancy. "I mean without your friend Percival knowing specifically," she wrote back. "He's been texting me weird questions about the timeline, and I don't want him poisoning things before we've even had the appointment together." I sat there staring at that message, genuinely confused, because Percival, my closest friend since college, had never once mentioned to me that he'd been in contact with Wren at all since the breakup, let alone asking her pointed questions about pregnancy timelines that apparently concerned her enough to specifically warn me away from him before this appointment. I called Percival that same evening, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the confusion churning underneath the question. "Hey, random question, but have you been texting Wren at all recently? About the pregnancy or the timeline or anything like that?" There was a pause on his end, long enough that I already knew, before he even answered, that something significant was about to shift in this entire situation. "Desmond, I've been trying to figure out how to bring this up with you for the past week. Actually. Yeah, I reached out to her. Not to cause trouble, I promise, but because something about this whole situation has felt off to me since you first told me, and I wanted to understand more before saying anything that might upset you unnecessarily." "What do you mean, off?" I asked, my chest tightening. "The timeline, man. You told me you two broke up right around 6 weeks before she told you she was pregnant, and that things had already been pretty distant for the month before that. Barely any actual intimacy in that final stretch. 6 weeks pregnant when she told you would put conception right around the breakup itself, maybe slightly before, which lines up weird with what you'd already told me about how things had cooled off between you two before the actual split." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, hearing my own quiet unease reflected back at me from someone else who'd apparently been doing the same mental math independently. "So what did you actually ask her?" I messaged her carefully, just asking if she'd confirmed the exact dating with her doctor yet, mentioning that early pregnancy tests can sometimes be a little imprecise on timing and that getting an accurate ultrasound date might help clarify things for both of you. She got defensive almost immediately, accused me of trying to stir up doubt and drama during an already difficult time, told me it wasn't my place to be asking questions like that at all. I processed that for a long moment, understanding suddenly why Wren had specifically warned me away from Percival before this upcoming appointment. Not because he'd been harassing her or overstepping some reasonable boundary, but because he'd apparently asked exactly the kind of direct, clarifying question that any actual medical appointment would answer definitively anyway, an ultrasound dating that would either confirm or contradict the timeline she'd given me. "Desmond," Percival said carefully, "I'm not trying to tell you she's definitely lying about something. Maybe the dating really is just a little imprecise. That does happen sometimes. But the fact that she specifically asked you to come to this appointment alone without me knowing, right after I asked her a direct question about confirming the dating, that feels like more than coincidence to me. I think you need to go to that appointment with your eyes open, paying close attention to exactly what the doctor says about how far along she actually is." I thanked him for his honesty, though I hung up the phone feeling far more unsettled than I had before making the call. The quiet unease I'd been managing internally for weeks now amplified by an outside perspective that had noticed and questioned exactly the same discrepancy I'd been too uncertain, or too afraid, to fully articulate myself. Over the following days leading up to the appointment, I found myself paying much closer attention to small details in my conversations with Wren, things I'd previously let slide without much scrutiny. She mentioned, almost offhand during one call, having gone to a friend's birthday party a few weeks before we broke up, describing details that, when I quietly cross-referenced against my own memory of our final weeks together, didn't quite match the timeline she'd originally given me for when exactly our relationship had actually ended versus when this particular party had happened. I also noticed, reviewing old text messages between us from those final weeks before the breakup, a specific gap of nearly 2 weeks where our conversations had grown notably sparse and distant. Weeks I now realized I had almost no actual account of what Wren had been doing during that period, information I'd simply never thought to ask about at the time because we were already drifting apart and I hadn't felt entitled to detailed updates on her daily life during a stretch where we were both clearly checking out of the relationship emotionally. By the time the appointment day arrived, I walked in with a very different mindset than I'd had when I first agreed to attend weeks earlier, no longer simply a nervous, uncertain almost father trying to do the responsible thing, but someone actively watching for specific, concrete information that might finally clarify whether the story I'd been told actually matched the medical reality Wren was about to have confirmed in front of me. The waiting room felt suffocating, all soft lighting and pastel colors designed to feel calming, doing absolutely nothing to settle the tight, watchful anxiety I'd been carrying since my conversation with Percival days earlier. Wren sat beside me, unusually quiet, fidgeting with the strap of her purse, and I found myself studying her more carefully than I had in weeks, watching for any small tell that might confirm or dispel the growing suspicion I'd been unable to fully shake. When the nurse finally called us back, Wren's hand found mine almost automatically, a gesture that would have felt natural and comforting just weeks earlier but now registered as something closer to performance, though I told myself, even then, to stay open to the possibility that I was reading too much into ordinary anxious behavior from someone genuinely nervous about a medical appointment. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Aldrich who greeted us both warmly, pulled up Wren's file on her computer and began the standard intake questions before moving into the actual examination. "So we're looking at confirming your dating today with an ultrasound," she said, glancing between the screen and Wren. "Your chart shows your last cycle started approximately 8 weeks and 2 days ago, Is that still accurate? I felt my entire body go still, doing the mental math immediately. 8 weeks and 2 days put conception well before the timeline Wren had originally given me, well before our actual breakup, back into a period when we'd already been distant and, as far as I understood our own relationship at the time, not intimate at all. That sounds right, Wren said, her voice noticeably tight, though she didn't look at me as she said it. Dr. Aldrich proceeded with the ultrasound, the screen filling with the grainy black and white image, and after a few moments of careful measurement, she said matter-of-factly, in the way medical professionals deliver information without necessarily understanding its personal weight. Based on the measurements today, this is consistent with approximately 8 weeks and 4 days, which lines up well with your reported cycle dates. Everything looks healthy and on track. I sat there absorbing that number, 8 weeks and 4 days, doing the math with an unsteady, precise clarity, understanding immediately that conception would have happened close to 9 weeks before this appointment, well before the 6-week timeline Wren had originally told me when she'd first broken the pregnancy news, and, more critically, well before our actual breakup, back into that stretch of weeks I now understood with sudden, devastating clarity that I genuinely had no reliable account of what Wren had actually been doing. I didn't say anything in the exam room, some instinct telling me this wasn't the moment to unravel everything in front of Dr. Aldrich, who continued speaking cheerfully about prenatal vitamins and next steps, entirely unaware of the ground shifting beneath the conversation happening silently beside her. Wren, for her part, remained tense and quiet throughout the rest of the appointment, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and defiance, though she offered no explanation, no acknowledgement of the discrepancy that had just been confirmed in clinical, unambiguous terms on that ultrasound screen. We walked out to the parking lot together in silence, and I finally stopped beside my car, turning to face her directly. The doctor said 8 weeks and 4 days. Wren, that doesn't match what you told me a month ago. That doesn't match our actual breakup timeline at all. She stood there for a long moment, her composure finally cracking slightly, tears welling up though I couldn't tell, in that moment, whether they were genuine distress or a practiced response to being cornered. I know, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it doesn't add up the way I told you. I need to explain, but not here, not in a parking lot. Can we go somewhere and actually talk about this properly? I felt something harden in my chest. The careful, cautious hope I'd been holding on to despite weeks of quiet unease finally giving way to something closer to cold, clear-eyed anger. You've had a month to explain this properly, Wren. I think you owe me an actual, honest answer right now, standing here before I get in this car. She leaned back against her own car, arms wrapped around herself, and finally, haltingly, began to explain. There was someone else before we officially broke up. It wasn't planned, it wasn't some big affair, it happened once, at a party about 2 weeks before we actually ended things, when I was already feeling like everything between us was falling apart anyway. I felt something cold and sick settle into my stomach, the specific 2-week gap in our old text messages I'd noticed while reviewing our conversation history, suddenly making devastating, complete sense. So this baby isn't mine. I don't know, she said quickly, too quickly, her voice climbing into something almost pleading. It's possible it's still yours. We were together right up until we actually broke up. There's still a chance the timing works out. Wren, the doctor just confirmed 8 weeks and 4 days. You told me we broke up nearly 6 weeks before you found out you were pregnant. And now you're telling me there was someone else 2 weeks before that breakup. Do the actual math. That timeline points directly at whoever this other person is, not me. She didn't have an immediate response to that, just stood there, tears now genuinely falling, though I found myself unable to summon much sympathy given what I was piecing together in real time. Why did you tell me it was mine in the first place? Why not just tell me the truth from the beginning, that there was a chance that you weren't sure? Because I was scared, she said. Scared of doing this alone. Scared of what it would mean if I told the other person. Scared that if I told you there was uncertainty, you'd just walk away completely and I'd be left dealing with everything by myself. I know that's not fair to you, I know I should have been honest from the start, but I panicked, and once I'd already told you it was definitely yours, it just felt impossible to walk that back. I stood there processing the full scope of what she was admitting, not just uncertainty about paternity that she'd chosen to hide, but a deliberate, sustained decision to tell me something she knew, or at minimum strongly suspected, wasn't necessarily true, allowing me to spend the past month emotionally preparing for fatherhood, showing up for doctor's appointments, restructuring my entire understanding of my near future, based on a story she'd apparently constructed specifically to secure my support without having to face the more complicated, uncertain reality herself. "Who's the other person?" I asked, my voice flat now, the anger settling into something colder and more controlled. She hesitated, then finally said a name I recognized immediately, someone from her workplace she'd mentioned occasionally over the 2 years we'd been together, always described in casual, friendly terms that had never once raised any concern on my part. "His name is Fitzgerald. We work together. It really was just the one time at that party. I promise it wasn't some ongoing thing. I don't actually care about the details of what happened with him," I said. "What I care about is that you knew, or at minimum strongly suspected, this timeline was complicated, and you chose to hide that from me for an entire month, letting me believe something you weren't actually certain was true." "I'm sorry," she said, and I could tell, watching her, that the apology was probably genuine in its own way, though it did little to address the actual damage of what she'd done. "I know I should have told you the truth from the start. I was just so scared of facing this alone. I need a paternity test," I said finally, cutting through whatever further explanation she was building toward. "As soon as it's medically possible to do one accurately. I'm not making any decisions, emotional or financial, about this pregnancy until I actually know whether this child is mine." She agreed, though I could see, even through her own visible distress, a flicker of something that looked like reluctant acceptance rather than genuine surprise, as though some part of her had known this moment of reckoning was inevitably coming once the ultrasound dating made the timeline impossible to continue obscuring. I drove home from that parking lot in a haze, calling Percival almost immediately once I'd pulled over somewhere safe enough to actually talk, needing to process everything with the one person who'd already been suspicious enough to push back on the timeline weeks before I'd been willing to fully confront it myself. He listened to the entire account without interrupting, and once I finished, he said something that helped ground me in that moment. "You did the right thing asking for the paternity test immediately, before getting any further emotionally invested. I know this whole situation is a mess, but at least now you actually have real information to work with instead of just a story she constructed." Over the following weeks, waiting for the earliest medically appropriate window for a paternity test, I found myself navigating a strange, suspended limbo, technically still connected to this entire pregnancy situation but no longer trusting anything Wren told me without independent verification. I spoke with a lawyer, a colleague of Marceline's actually, someone who specialized specifically in paternity and custody matters, wanting to understand my rights and obligations regardless of how the eventual test results turned out. The lawyer, a careful, measured woman named Ottilie, explained that a non-invasive prenatal paternity test could actually be conducted relatively early, using a blood sample from Wren along with a cheek swab from me, providing results with a high degree of accuracy without needing to wait until after birth. She helped me arrange everything properly through a legitimate, court-recognized testing service, wanting to ensure whatever results came back would hold up as legally reliable documentation regardless of how the situation eventually unfolded. I informed Wren about the specific testing arrangement, and she agreed to it, though our communication during this period grew increasingly strained, most conversations now happening through brief, business-like messages about logistics rather than anything resembling the emotional intimacy we'd shared even during those first confused weeks after she'd initially told me about the pregnancy. During this waiting period, I also found myself thinking a lot about Fitzgerald, the man Wren had named as the other possibility, wondering whether he even knew about any of this, whether Wren had told him the same complicated, uncertain story she'd apparently constructed for me, or whether she'd simply omitted him entirely from her account the way she'd initially tried to omit any uncertainty from mine. I decided, after some deliberation, to reach out to him directly, finding his information easily enough through the same workplace details Wren had mentioned over our years together. I kept the message simple and factual, explaining who I was, the situation regarding the pregnancy timeline, and asking whether he was aware of any of this himself. His response came quickly, and the surprise evident in his message suggested he genuinely hadn't known anything about the situation at all. "I had no idea," he wrote. "Wren and I hooked up once, a while back, nothing serious, and she never mentioned anything about being pregnant since then. I appreciate you telling me directly. I'd want to know for certain too, if this turns out to actually involve me." We ended up talking on the phone a few days later, an oddly familiar dynamic given my earlier experience with Barnaby in an entirely different situation months prior. Two men brought together by the same woman's incomplete honesty, both trying to navigate genuine uncertainty about a pregnancy neither of us had been given full, accurate information about from the start. "She told me it was probably yours," Fitzgerald admitted during that call, echoing back a version of the same selective, managed honesty I'd already experienced myself. I figured that meant I didn't need to worry about it being mine specifically, so I never pushed for more details or asked about testing myself. Between the two of us, we arranged for both potential fathers to complete the necessary testing alongside Wren's sample, wanting definitive answers rather than continuing to operate off her selectively managed version of events regardless of which one of us the results eventually confirmed. The results came back almost 3 weeks after the initial ultrasound appointment, delivered through Ottilie's office rather than directly from Wren, an arrangement I'd specifically requested to ensure the information reached me through a neutral, verified channel rather than potentially being filtered or delayed by Wren herself. I remember exactly where I was when I got the call from Ottilie's assistant, sitting at my desk at work, unable to focus on anything for the entire morning, knowing the results were expected that day. "The test results confirm Fitzgerald as the biological father," she told me, her voice carefully professional despite the weight of what she was delivering. The probability came back at over 99%, which is standard for a conclusive positive result in these tests. I sat there for a long moment after hanging up, feeling a strange, complicated mixture of emotions I hadn't fully anticipated, relief certainly, at finally having definitive clarity after weeks of uncertainty, but also a fresh wave of anger at the entire situation. The month I'd spent genuinely believing I might be about to become a father, the doctor's appointment I'd attended emotionally preparing myself for exactly that reality. All of it built on a story Wren had told knowing, even if not, with absolute certainty, that there was a significant chance it wasn't actually true. I called Fitzgerald first since we'd agreed to share whatever results came back regardless of the outcome, and he received the news with a kind of resigned, quiet acceptance that suggested he'd been mentally preparing for exactly this possibility over the preceding weeks. "I figured it might come back this way," he said. "I appreciate you including me in this whole process, honestly. I know it would have been easier for you to just handle everything privately with Wren once you found out it wasn't yours. But I'm glad I got real information instead of just whatever she eventually decided to tell me." I called Wren after that, keeping the conversation brief and factual, informing her that the results had confirmed Fitzgerald as the biological father, and that I considered our involvement in this specific situation concluded going forward. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of what sounded like genuine grief and something closer to resignation, as though some part of her had known, even before the results came back, exactly how this was actually going to unfold. "I'm sorry, Desmond," she said. "I know that doesn't fix anything, and I know I handled this whole situation badly from the very beginning. I just want you to know I never meant to hurt you this deeply. I was scared, and I made a series of increasingly bad decisions trying to manage that fear instead of just being honest with you from the start." I told her I appreciated the apology genuinely, but that I needed distance from her going forward, that whatever remained of our relationship, even the complicated post-breakup version we'd been navigating over the past month, needed to end entirely now that the actual medical reality had been established. She didn't fight that decision, seeming to understand, finally, that the sustained deception had cost her whatever remaining trust or goodwill I might have still extended toward her otherwise. In the weeks following that final conversation, I found myself processing not just the immediate relief of no longer being uncertainly, precariously tied to a pregnancy that wasn't actually mine, but the deeper, more unsettling recognition of how easily I'd been managed throughout the entire process, how willing I'd been, even amid my own quiet unease about the timeline, to override my own instincts in favor of showing up as the responsible, supportive partner Wren clearly needed me to be, regardless of whether the underlying story actually held up to scrutiny. I talked through this extensively with my own therapist, someone I started seeing specifically in the aftermath of this entire situation, working through not just the immediate betrayal but the broader pattern it revealed about my own tendency to extend trust and support even when quiet, persistent doubts were already signaling that something didn't quite add up. About 2 months after the paternity results confirmed Fitzgerald as the father, I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, still in occasional contact with him, our shared experience of having both been managed through Wren's selective honesty, creating an unusual bond similar to what I'd experienced with Barnaby months earlier in an entirely different situation. He mentioned, during one of these conversations, that he and Wren had actually decided to try building some kind of relationship together, given the pregnancy and his confirmed paternity, though he described the arrangement with a cautious, guarded quality that suggested he was approaching it with considerably more scrutiny than he might have otherwise, given everything he'd learned about how easily she'd managed information during those first uncertain weeks. I told her flat out, he said, that I need complete transparency going forward about everything, not just this specific situation but generally, if we're actually going to try co-parenting successfully. I don't think she loved hearing that, but she agreed to it, and honestly, given everything you went through, I'm not willing to extend the same kind of blind trust one might have otherwise. I appreciated hearing that, a small, indirect sense that some good had come from the painful clarity of my own experience, even if it primarily benefited Fitzgerald rather than myself directly. I found myself, over those following months, slowly rebuilding my own sense of stability and trust in my instincts, working through therapy the specific pattern my therapist helped me identify, a tendency to override quiet, persistent doubts in favor of extending trust and support, particularly in situations involving genuine emotional stakes and someone else's vulnerability. You noticed the timeline discrepancy almost immediately, my therapist pointed out during one of our sessions. Your instincts were actually working correctly from the very beginning. The pattern worth examining isn't a failure of perception, it's the specific choice to override that accurate perception in favor of showing up as the responsible, supportive person you believed the situation required, regardless of what your own instincts were already telling you. That reframing helped significantly, shifting my understanding of the entire experience from a story about being fooled or deceived, though that element certainly existed too, toward a more nuanced recognition of my own pattern of self-doubt, a tendency to distrust my own accurate observations in favor of extending benefit of the doubt even when the actual evidence available to me suggested a different, more troubling reality. I started dating again cautiously around the 4-month mark after everything had fully resolved, working consciously to notice and trust my own instincts earlier and more consistently than I had during the entire Wren situation, rather than talking myself into ignoring quiet, persistent unease simply because acknowledging it felt uncomfortable or potentially unfair to someone else's stated version of events. Percival, throughout this entire process, remained a steady, grounding presence, and I found myself genuinely grateful, in ways I hadn't fully articulated to him directly, for his willingness to reach out to Wren himself weeks before the appointment, asking exactly the kind of direct question that ultimately helped surface the discrepancy I'd been too hesitant to fully confront on my own. I almost didn't say anything to you about texting her, he admitted once, months later. I was worried you'd think I was overstepping, or that I was trying to sabotage things between you two during an already difficult time. I'm glad I said something anyway, even though it made for an uncomfortable conversation initially. I'm glad you did too, I told him honestly. I think, left entirely to my own instincts, I might have kept talking myself out of the doubt I was already quietly carrying, right up until the actual appointment forced the timeline into inescapable clinical clarity. Around the 8-month mark since that original ultrasound appointment, I heard, through Fitzgerald, that Wren had given birth to a healthy daughter, information he shared with a mixture of genuine excitement and continued caution about how their own co-parenting arrangement was actually unfolding in practice. I felt, hearing that news, a complicated mixture of emotions, no lingering personal investment in the child itself given the confirmed test results months earlier, but a kind of distant, residual awareness of how close I'd come to building an entirely different version of my near future around a story that ultimately hadn't been true. I sent Fitzgerald a brief, sincere congratulations, and he responded with genuine warmth, mentioning that things between him and Wren had actually settled into something reasonably functional, not a romantic relationship exactly, but a workable co-parenting arrangement built on the more careful, transparent communication he'd insisted on from the very beginning of their renewed involvement with each other. I think honestly, he told me during that conversation, going through what you went through, watching how close you came to building your whole world around information that turned out to be incomplete, made me approach everything with Wren much more carefully than I probably would have otherwise. I don't think our daughter would have the stable situation she has now if I hadn't insisted on that transparency from the start, which, in a strange way, I probably owe partly to what happened with you. I appreciated that acknowledgement, finding some genuine, if complicated, sense of meaning in the idea that my own difficult experience had contributed, indirectly, to a better outcome for a child who otherwise had nothing to do with any of the original deception that had briefly, painfully entangled my own life with hers before the truth finally surfaced. I ran into Wren once, unexpectedly, about 10 months after everything had concluded, at a grocery store across town, and the encounter was brief and stilted, both of us clearly uncomfortable navigating the aftermath of everything that had happened between us. She looked tired in the particular way new parents often do, though also I noticed genuinely present and engaged when she mentioned briefly some small detail about her daughter that came up naturally in the course of our few minutes of forced small talk. "I hope you're doing well," she said, as we prepared to go our separate ways. "I know I handled everything so badly. I think about it more than you probably realize." "I'm doing well," I told her honestly, and found, saying it, that it was actually true, no longer carrying the raw anger of those first difficult months, settled instead into something closer to distant, complicated peace with an experience that had ultimately taught me more about my own patterns and instincts than I would have anticipated when it first began. I've been in a new relationship for about 4 months now, someone named Cordelia, a graphic designer I met through mutual friends, and I found myself throughout this new relationship paying much closer, more deliberate attention to the quiet, instinctive signals I might have previously talked myself out of noticing or acting on. It's not suspicion exactly, not a pattern of doubting Cordelia specifically, but a genuine, hard-won commitment to trusting my own perception and asking direct questions early, rather than extending unquestioning support in ways that override what my own instincts are already quietly telling me. My therapist and I have talked extensively about this shift, framing it not as becoming more guarded or less trusting in some broadly negative sense, but as developing a healthier, more integrated relationship with my own judgment, one where genuine care and support for a partner doesn't require silencing or dismissing legitimate observations simply because voicing them feels uncomfortable or potentially unfair in the moment. It's been just over a year now since that first ultrasound appointment, since Dr. Aldrich's matter-of-fact delivery of a date that shattered a month's worth of careful, uncertain hope I'd been building around a version of my future that turned out never to have been real in the way Wren had presented it. Looking back at the entire experience now, I find myself understanding it less as a story about betrayal specifically, though it certainly was that, and more as a story about the particular, quiet cost of overriding your own accurate instincts in favor of doing what you believe is the responsible, generous thing, even when the actual evidence available to you is already suggesting a different reality. Percival remains one of the most important people in my life, and I've made a point, in the year since everything unfolded, of actually thanking him properly, more than once, for his willingness to push back gently on something that could easily have unfolded very differently if he'd simply deferred to what he might have assumed was none of his business. "I think a lot of people in your position would have stayed quiet," I told him during one conversation. "Would have figured it wasn't their place to question what I was being told, even if they had their own doubts." "I almost did stay quiet," he admitted. "But something about the specific way the timeline didn't add up bothered me enough that I couldn't just let it go without at least asking a direct question. I'm glad I trusted that instinct, even though it made things uncomfortable initially." Fitzgerald and I still check in occasionally, less frequently now than during those first intense months of shared uncertainty, but with a genuine, lasting warmth built out of an unusual, difficult shared experience. He sends me occasional photos of his daughter, small updates about her development, and I find myself genuinely glad each time that whatever complicated circumstances originally connected our lives, the actual outcome, at least from what I can observe, seems to be a genuinely loved, stable child, born into a co-parenting arrangement built on more honesty and transparency than the situation originally started with. My relationship with Cordelia has continued developing steadily over these past months, built consciously and deliberately on the kind of open, immediate communication I wasn't able to fully practice with Wren, partly because I hadn't yet developed the specific skill of trusting my own quiet instincts enough to voice them directly rather than talking myself out of concerns that felt uncomfortable to raise. I told her, fairly early in our relationship, a condensed version of everything that had happened with Wren, not out of any need to relitigate the past, but because I wanted her to understand why I sometimes ask more direct, specific questions than might otherwise seem necessary, a habit I've deliberately built rather than apologized for. I'd rather know I'm asking too many questions than find out later I ignored my own instincts to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. I told her, and she, understanding the context, responded with the kind of patient, genuine transparency that has, over these months, slowly rebuilt my broader capacity to trust again, not blindly, but with the kind of grounded, active attention I wish I'd extended to my own instincts from the very beginning of the situation with Wren. I think sometimes about that specific text message that started everything unraveling, come to my appointment alone without anyone else knowing, and how much information was actually contained in that single, seemingly small request, if I'd been willing at the time to actually sit with what it implied rather than accepting the surface-level explanation Wren offered when I pushed back. The specificity of that request, the deliberate exclusion of Percival, the person who'd apparently already started asking the exact right questions, should have told me almost everything I needed to know weeks before that ultrasound screen finally, clinically, made the truth impossible to continue avoiding. I don't regret how everything ultimately unfolded, difficult as it was, because the entire experience forced a kind of genuine self-examination I don't think I would have otherwise undertaken, a recognition that being a good, supportive person doesn't actually require overriding your own accurate perception of reality, that genuine care and honest, direct questions aren't fundamentally in conflict with each other, however uncomfortable it might feel in the moment to ask the harder question. Instead of simply accepting the easier, more emotionally convenient version of events someone else is presenting to you. That's the lesson I carry forward now into this new relationship, into every relationship going forward, built not on suspicion or guardedness for its own sake, but on the hard-won understanding that trusting yourself and trusting someone else were never actually meant to be opposing forces in the first place, however difficult that particular lesson turned out to be to learn.